Hi, my name's Natty, or Mary, because Mary, the Mother of God, the Theotokos, the Virgin Mary, she is my patron saint. I used to be a men's rights activist, so I spent around 5 to 6 years promoting a theory called gynocentrism, which is this idea that the West overall is gynocentric, and that has what's given rise to feminism. And this justification is what underpins most of the arguments you will see online regarding feminism. Anti feminist perspectives from the manosphere, red pill, the right wing at large, Christian nationalism, even, and Christian fundamentalism all play into this theory now that the West is gynocentric. But I don't think most people understand or know where this theory came from. So in the early 1900s, this term was used to criticize American culture from a European perspective. And then it was also used by feminists in the 1970s and by some Marxists in the early 1900s as well. So what a guy called Peter Wright has done, the author of the theory that everybody currently uses, but they don't know it, has codified and collected all the perspectives about gynocentrism together, and then created a sort of narrative of his own. And the way that people use the term now is exactly how Peter Wright has promoted it. He popularized it. And if it wasn't for him, then most people would not be using it as justification for their criticisms against feminism or women's autonomy in general in the West. So I'm going to read to you something that I've come up with to try and really give you a good insight into what this theory is about. All right, Peter Wright, writing within the men's rights and anti-feminist tradition, frames gynocentrism as a long-standing Western cultural orientation that idealizes and privileges women at the expense of men. One of his more unusual claims is that this tendency is rooted in the Christian veneration of the Virgin Mary. He argues that Mary functions as a civilizational archetype of female purity, compassion, and moral superiority, which in his view became embedded in Western consciousness and institutions. For Wright, Marian devotion provided a model of female sanctity that placed women on a pedestal, encouraging men to protect, defer to, and serve women in a way that went beyond religious devotion and seeped into broader cultural norms. Beneath this framing lies Wright's evident resentment toward the Virgin Mary as a symbolic figure. He interprets her exaltation not as a source of spiritual or theological richness, but as the foundation of what he sees as a cultural imbalance, the systemic prioritization of female needs and perspectives over men's. His writings portray Marian veneration as the starting point of a gynocentric order that, in his view, later merged with chivalry and feminism to create a society overly centered on women. Thus, his critique of Mary is not primarily theological, but ideological, using her as a symbol of what he perceives as the origins of men's dispossession in the West. Wright's thesis about the Virgin Mary as the fountainhead of Western gynocentrism rests on a shallow and, from a Christian perspective, distorted reading of Marian theology. In both Catholic and Orthodox tradition, Mary is not exalted as an autonomous female archetype, but as Theotokos, the God-bearer, whose significance derives entirely from her relationship to Christ. She is honored because she gave her free yes to God's will. She gave her consent. Not because she embodies abstract female moral superiority. In fact, patristic writers consistently emphasize that her humility and obedience are virtues for all Christians, male and female alike. The idea that Marian devotion created a unilateral cultural elevation of women ignores the far more balanced reality. Mary is venerated precisely as the model of human cooperation with divine grace, not as the justification for privileging one sex over another. Wright also misrepresents the historical development of Western chivalry and later feminist movements by conflating them with Marian devotion. While medieval chivalric ideals sometimes drew symbolic imagery from Mary, they were equally shaped by feudal hierarchies, martial codes, and the cult of courtly love, which often distorted Christian teaching rather than flowing directly from it. Similarly, I knew I was not going to get through this without mispronouncing a word. Modern feminism did not arise from Marian theology, but from Enlightenment ideas of individual rights and equality, or egalitarianism. By collapsing all of these distinct historical threads into a single gynocentric narrative rooted in resentment of the Virgin, Wright imposes a reductionist framework that obscures the spiritual meaning of Marian veneration and oversimplifies the complexity of Western cultural history. So that's quite a lot to process and take in, because it is a kind of academic essay, in academic speak. I think the main point I want people to take from this video is that Peter Wright claims in his writings that our cultural norm in the West was that men were expected to be Christ-like and therefore self-sacrificial, and women were not expected to be Christ-like and not expected to be self-sacrificial, because his view of Mary is that she was placed on a pedestal and seen as a lady over everyone, like a feudal lord. And this is just not true. Ask any Orthodox Christian, even though Orthodoxy was not really present in the West until, recently. It's not influenced the culture. Roman Catholics, who I would say are my siblings in Christ, even though their churches are in schism, I would never, ever claim that they promoted in the culture that women were to be seen on a pedestal and above everyone with some kind of superiority compared to men. Peter Wright also infers in his writings that there were some ladies of the court, he mentions Eleanor of Aquitaine and some others, who kind of came up with a Kabbalistic conspiracy to covertly control men, and that kind of tradition continued. It's very strange, and I think there has been themes like this in popular culture, this idea of the queen whispering in the king's ear, and therefore she is the true influence on everything. That has been played around with in our kind of collective psyche, I suppose. But this idea that the church promoted it as a kind of norm, it's just simply not true. And I think people who believe the red pill manosphere framework, they would probably argue that their perspective of gynocentrism is different to Peter's, because Peter's is more constructionist in origin. However, the only reason they have access to or use that theory is because of Peter's work, because Peter's work was gaining steam online around the same time with the kind of manosphere, game theory, pickup artist, red pill scene. So you could say that they are the kind of gender essentialist side, and Peter Wright is the more egalitarian side. And I'm going to do another video which goes into more detail about how we can think about these two sides and how they argue with each other. But really, they just both end up in the same place, the same conclusion, which is this idea that women were not expected to be properly accountable and self-sacrificial like men have been, and now they need to be. And that this is something that we need to reconcile and atone for. It's a particularly concerning and destructive way of looking at things. And I can criticize feminism all day long because I don't agree with egalitarianism, which is where feminism basically reacted from. Feminism was not the precursor to egalitarianism and individualism. It's the result of it. But I will go into that in more detail in another video. Thank you for listening, and God bless.